Hello everyone, my name is Berend Albers-de-Gier. I work at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences in AI ethics. However, what I present today is the work I did before this in University of Twente. So I have some slides to add. There. So today I'll talk about the Datafication Framework. Let's see. So this project is called. I'll tell about the project, and then I'll look at data and different perspectives on data, and then I'll present the framework that I developed, and finally touch upon the methodology in the project. So first, the project PDEng stands for Professional Doctorate in Engineering, and this is a 2-year research design project. So it's kind of a half PhD here in the Netherlands. The sponsoring company of this project was the cleaning company Acito, and the project was done under supervision by Jos van Hilligersberg and Peter Paul Verbeek, who I assume a lot of you will know. And the project started out with the question of measuring customer experience. So in the context of cleaning, that is, for example, travelers on Schiphol Airport, and they might be asked with the feedback now buttons with green, yellow, and red smileys of their opinion of how clean it is. And so it started out with this very concrete question of measuring customer experience. And during the project, it shifted more to focus on a conceptual view of bias in data. And right here, I want to also emphasize that on the one hand, we can say philosophically that there is no bias in data, or maybe that the data is always already biased, in the sense that bias implies a deviation from some kind of normal. And so saying that the data is biased would imply that the data is otherwise neutral or objective. However, in a practical sense, the vocabulary is this, so people know what you're talking about. And also there are very concrete problematic cases and harms in relation to these biases. So that's why I keep using the term here, and maybe we'll discuss at the end. So the starting point is the Verbeekian Postphenomenology, with the core concept of mediation and the technological intentionality. That is this concept of we are not autonomous subjects, but the technologies that we use, they help us relate to the world. So this is what we talk about when we say human-technology relations. However, there is a very strong focus on physical devices and on actualized use of these tools, especially in the work of Peter Paul Verbeek. And there is a kind of misfit with IT, because the physical part is only a small part of IT. There's a lot happening behind the screen. And also, it's not just when you're actually using things that there is a kind of influence. For example, in this idea of always being online, that is not just something that when you're browsing the internet happens. So I have to look around to add other perspectives. So first starting point is very obvious to look within IT. And so what you see presented here is a typical model of a data pipeline where for an IT perspective, you see that the project or the data goes through a number of stages. when you start with gathering data and you do data preparation, visualization, analysis, and at the end there will be some kind of answer, which is yes or no, or a kind of classification or a prediction of some kind. And what's important to note here is the scope. So the starting point is to have data, and the end point is the answer presented. And also what's not in scope is the questions of how those data came to be, or the context in which the answers are used. So if we contrast that with a perspective from science and technology studies and media studies, there's a lot of emphasis on what happens before the data. And specifically in the book, Raw Data is an Oxymoron. Gietelman and Jackson emphasize that there is not just interpretation of data at the end of such a data pipeline, but there is a kind of interpretation before there is any data, because before there is data, there is all kinds of design choices, and those design choices, they also require different interpretations. So if this data pipeline is the hammer or the tool of this data, then the STS presents a kind of a view of what happens before. And well, we may know that Peter Paul Verbeek really likes to emphasize that he prefers looking forward. But I think that in the case of bias in data, it's justified to also look backwards in this sense. And in the position of looking forward, I want to also add another piece of the puzzle, which is presented by Cathy O'Neill in the book Weapons of Math Destruction, where she explains that beautifully with the case of predictive policing, where she says historic data is used to do kind of interventions, and those interventions result in new data. So people being arrested, those arrest records are new data, and those are used again to send out new patrol cars and to do more policing. So you get a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So those elements that you see presented here, I worked that out into a datafication framework. And I'll go step by step through this model, hopefully quickly. So the first step is the domain model, and this is a theoretical view of the domain. And what's important here is that this is a specific interpretation of the domain. And so this is one lens, and there is aspects that are not in the model that are part of the world. So what you see here is one such model on customer experience in cleaning. And the important part is that there's a lot of emphasis on things that do not have directly to do with cleaning activities. So experience of cleaning is, for example, the architecture. Is the building new or is it old? Is there a lot of light? What is the use of colors? And then the next step is the actual data that you're creating. And what's interesting here, I mentioned already those feedback now buttons. What's interesting here is that there can be a large gap between the domain model and the data model. So in this case, you see here a very rich domain model with a lot of variables, and only one thing gets measured. And in a lot of actual projects, the first step is skipped altogether. And the starting point is just either gather data or data that already exists is being used. And that means that not so much that there is no domain model, but that the domain model remains implicit and is not critically examined. So the next step, the actual algorithms. So what you see here is the Schiphol case, where clean and unclean votes for the toilet are visualized and then created into a model. That's what you see on the right side. And when you see a blue dot in the red area or a red dot in a blue area, those are the false positives and the false negatives, where the model predicted that the toilet would be clean or would be unclean, and the users evaluated it differently. And this is the question of what is the mathematics that you're using and is that appropriate? So for example, again, the Cathy O'Neill, she mentions that if you work in finance and you're right 51% of the time, you can make money. But those kind of error margins are not really appropriate for, let's say, the criminal justice. So the kind of mathematics and the kind of margins that you use have to be appropriate for the domain that you apply them in. So then the, let's say, mediation part of it, the data is turned into some kind of visualization, and that is given to a manager on the floor. And when he gets a message, then he sends a cleaner to do the cleaning. And where the mathematical model may have a lot of uncertainty in it, the visualization often presents a picture that looks a lot more certain. So there is a kind of gap between the models behind the visualization and the actual visualizations. And then finally, the feedback loop that you see here, which is actually an explicit part of this, that when the red buttons are clicked, that is not only the trigger for intervention, but the interventions have the explicit purpose of getting more green votes. So it's not as problematic as the predictive policing case, but it's the same basic principle behind it. So finally, a note on the methodology, which is action design research, and it's kind of an iterative approach. And in those 2 years, I made several prototypes and tested those with the company in different ways, and then finally came up with this this framework. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, I hope that I may be able to answer them. Thank you very much.